Welcome back to another episode of the Grappling Growth podcast with me, Joe Testory. On today's podcast, I was fortunate to have Shane Carlin, the founder of Asian Student Achievement, an NGO based in the United States to help Asian and Asian American students take their journey through the pipeline of education and into leadership positions throughout the States. I came into contact with Shane about a month or so ago, and we hit it off. We had fantastic conversations, and it was really driven by his story. Shane was actually left on the corner of a street in Seoul, South Korea in 1971. And he talks about the synergies and the alignment between him being left as an orphan and being an orphan for 6 years until he was taken in by his American family in Kentucky, and how that has affected him and led him to create his NGO. For me, talking to Shane was great. It was a bit of an experience whereby you could really get behind and see the vision into someone and why they do what they do. So this podcast might resonate to someone out there. If you enjoy the show, please tune in, share it with a friend. As entrepreneurs, we all experience challenges in our business journey. I'm Joe Testory, and the Grappling Growth podcast is my attempt at documenting my entrepreneurial journey while building my brands. I sit down with fellow entrepreneurs, understanding how they grapple with growth. I hope you find value and enjoy. Shane, welcome to the Grappling Growth podcast. How are you doing today?
Great, Joe. Thank you so much.
Shane, my first question to you today is, what does growth look like to you?
Growth for our organization looks like where we will have Asian Student Achievement chapters at college campuses nationwide. And many years down the road, they will be international, where we will have student chapters at colleges and universities, hopefully in Asia, Europe, and other places like that support the Asian Pacific Islander populations.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, you touched upon it before when we spoke, but could you just, for the listeners more so, give a bit of a summary into the organization and how you got started back in 2016?
No, thank you for that question. Asian Student Achievement is now a nonprofit to help move Asian and Asian Americans through the pipeline to leadership via 3 prongs: one-on-one educational and vocational soft skills coaching, as well as educational and vocational soft skills speaking engagements at colleges and universities. And we've even sprouted out to corporations where they're working with their Asian American Pacific Islander employee resource groups and different things like that, where, for example, I recently spoke at a company doing public speaking. In fact, the title from one of my colleagues from back in the past labeled it as Learn Public Speaking from a TEDx Speaker, which I had the fortune of doing a TEDx speech in the mid-2000s. And so I started this in 2016 as a corporation, LLC, and different things like that, because I had been working with college students from 1995 to the present. And one of the things, Shane Carlin sounds Irish, but I'm actually a Korean adoptee. So I was raised by white parents. And on the side, I was able to work with Asian and Asian American students. And one of the things I learned was not all of them, but a majority of them had issues in dealing with the soft skills. And I, in terms of networking, public speaking, interviewing techniques, and different things like that. So I've always wanted to start up my own organization, and I flirted with the idea, as I said, with the corporation LLC, and we even used to call it, we're a for-profit with a nonprofit mission, and I said, what the heck, let's just change it to a nonprofit. So about 4 years ago, we changed it to a nonprofit mission. So basically, we're going out there and speaking at colleges, universities, corporations, doing one-on-one coaching, and in partnership with another national nonprofit, we do have a diversity-driven job board.
So you mentioned you were a LLC for-profit business, pivoted over to becoming a non-profit. At the root, what was the big driver into making that change? Because it isn't a small change within the business, and it changes the direction of maximizing shareholders' wealth compared to focusing on growing the organization and really focusing on encompassment of students.
our mission didn't change. So candidly, it was we needed to make money, right? And because it was a nonprofit concept, people weren't really interested in paying for a for-profit with a nonprofit concept, if that makes sense. And because I also have 18 years of fundraising experience, it made it easier for me to not only utilize the connections, the generous connections that I have, to be able to not only get into the speaking circuit with folks, but also asking individual donors and corporations that will more relate to nonprofits versus a for profit. So, in fact, one of the questions I ask our intern candidates is what is the number one thing that any organization needs? And a lot of them are lovely when they say stuff like communication, teamwork, all important. But then when I tell them it's actually money, then they're really, sometimes they're surprised, sometimes they're like, oh, now I get it. Or sometimes they actually get it and actually give me the response right out of the gate. Without money, we can't be able to do all that. So I even teach our interns about ROI, return on investment, when they have an 8 month internship with us,
You
because
mentioned,
whether they know it or not, wherever they go in their future, they may be the primary, the secondary, or the third level of bringing in dollars into their nonprofit or for-profit organizations that they'll be a part of. And let's be honest, even in government agencies, they're still finding funds to be able to make sure that the money goes in. And one way of that, of course, is uh, politicking with politicians and all that on the government agency side.
hmm fundamentally within whatever you're doing or whatever organization, you need value drivers because ultimately that will
Exactly.
just lead to soccer clubs for us, football clubs, sorry, soccer clubs that you'd call them, and even any sports organization. There's a bit of a you're a sportsman yourself, aren't you?
Right, I am.
So with that, you see a lot of clubs, not a lot of clubs, but clubs over time they go under, so to speak, and people say, "Oh, football is a dying art." But ultimately, in order to pay players the big bucks, the big wages and salaries, you need enough money coming in when you're not bleeding money. Because eventually, you bleed money. Enough time goes along, that's it. The business, organization, or sporting institution will collapse eventually. Moving a little bit away from business, and I really was curious to touch upon. You mentioned your surname, Carlin, and even Shane isn't the most traditional Korean name. Could you shed a bit more light into your story from youth and birth?
Sure. No, thanks for that question. In fact, back to that statement of my public speaking talk of learn public speaking from a TEDx speaker is because I did do a TEDx talk on my adoptee story. And so Shane Carlin does sound Irish. I was raised by white parents, Caucasian parents in northern Kentucky near Cincinnati, Ohio. But I was left on a street corner when I was a baby,
Where was
found
this?
by, I'm sorry, in Seoul, South Korea. And so I was found by a police officer who took me to an orphanage
How old
and
were
stayed
you?
there actually for 6 years. Yeah. So from when I was an infant to 6 years of being in the orphanage. And so that's where I stayed there. And then it took uh, my adoptive parents a minute to get through all the paperwork and all the processing. They had identified me a lot sooner. In fact, there have been letters exchanged back and forth from the orphanage to my parents and vice versa. And came over here and then lived on a farm. The whole works. My sister is the biological child to my adopted parents. She's 1 year older. And then even when I was in seventh grade, my parents decided to adopt a another child, now my other sibling, who is adopted from Bogota, Colombia. So we're kind of like the United Nations. And then I did my undergrad at the University of Kentucky, and then my master's at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. So that's hence why the sports is very big too, because of the University of Kentucky basketball program and others.
And you mentioned you found on a street corner in Seoul. I probably don't have memory, but how old were you approximately?
According to the records, I was an infant. There was no record of information on me. So the doctors had to estimate my birth. My birthday was just celebrated on April the 2nd, but that's actually made up because they had to estimate it. So they're somewhat accurate, probably close to a few days or month, but ultimately it was basically their estimates as professionals to be able to say, okay, this is what we think his age is, because that was in 1971 or 72, right? So, in terms of when all that happened, actually, it would have been 71. So, the technology today could be more accurate than it was back then. So, who knows how accurate they were, but close to it.
And I'm fascinated, but you
Yeah.
mentioned you were in an orphanage for 6 years. What I'm sure these are questions you've probably asked your adopted parents, but what sparked their interest from picking a baby, a child from South Korea and bringing them over to the US?
Well, my mother couldn't have any more kids, and my mother and father decided that they would adopt. And at the time, they went through an agency called Holt here in the United States. And then Holt had relationships with the various different countries around the world that were, having babies available or children available for adoption. And so that was the whole point of my parents wanting that. One of the other questions that I get a lot is, have you looked into, especially with today's technology of DNA and all that, my biological parents or family? And I have not done that. And candidly, if I do that, I would probably do it after, my family, my mother sadly passed away in 2019, but my father is still alive, and I just don't want to hurt their feelings. And because I don't want them to think that I'm trying to leave the nucleus family that took care of me to where I am today and looking out for another family. So if I do that, it'd be after he sadly leaves our earth.
Well, first and foremost, I'm sorry to hear about your mother.
Oh,
Linking
thank you.
into what you've done for the past 25, 30 years, your childhood, your backstory, do you think that played any part into you working in academia and looking at the next generation of development and equally tying into what you're doing now? Do you think there's a link there? There's a causality?
Oh, I definitely do. There's what we call external factors and then innate factors, right? The innate of like what you're born with, what you're raised with. And I definitely think and I was definitely raised in a very wholesome Christian educational family,
Hmm.
also on a farm. So you learn work ethic. I'm going a little tangent on this, but I always jokingly say I want to see on a resume if they worked on a farm, because I can teach you everything else, but I can't teach you work ethic. Because as the saying goes, without the work ethic of a farm, animals die, plants die if you don't work, right? And so it wasn't like a huge farm, but it was still, we had cattle, we had, you know, um, uh, plants and different things like that. So we still tended to the land in different ways, not at an aggressive way like big time farming. But that in addition to I'm an extrovert. I love the attention. I love going out there talking to people, networking, even when I was a kid. And then going to the story of like as an adoptee running, starting and running an Asian American Pacific Islander organization is because as I was growing up, I jokingly said the only Asian I saw was the one in the mirror because there weren't many and in my community. So I actually, um, my parents did their best because I jokingly say I look young and cute, but I'm 54. And with that said, we didn't have internet as I was growing up until grad school or maybe latter part of undergrad. And so they didn't have the resources that today's adoptees have now. They didn't have chat rooms. They don't have Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all these type or the World Wide Web to look for resources, right? So we just had to rely on whatever was in the greater Cincinnati community. And there wasn't that much discussed in terms of those. So my parents did their very best to like try to get me to learn more about my identity. There were some parts that I got excited about, but there were other parts I didn't want to know because when I go back to my school, mostly all white kids, who's going to be interested in what I just learned about myself, right? And so there was this pull and tug. They did their very best for what was available. And then it wasn't until graduate school that someone said, Shane, when you're not with your adoptive parents and they only know you as my parents' name, all they see you as Asian. And it really hit me hard in a manner of like, wow, I've got to like do everything I can to learn about my identity. Now, like any kid, every kid gets made fun of when they're a child, but mine was exacerbated because when I was growing up, Bruce Lee was the media attention of Asians and karate and different things like that. So they, called me grasshopper. They did accents at me. They called me Chinese or Japanese or, the slanted eye. So every epithet one could do towards my look, they did that. And I think as I got older, I wanted to be like, wait, I need to know what all this means. So not only did I want to know more about my Korean identity, but I also wanted to know about my Asian American history. So what is Asian American history? From the internment camps of Japanese, the Chinese that were immigrated for the railroads, or the Vincent Chin murder case in Detroit. Those type of things that would have an effect of my identity development. So what I did was I kind of did a negotiation with the Asian American Association that we call AAA at Miami University and said, hey, I'll be the student affairs practitioner to be your advisor if you would please teach me more about Asian American identity and Korean American identity. And many of those students were very wonderful and engaging in helping me want to do that. And then from there, when I moved to Chicago, I worked at Northwestern University and was working with the AAPI student orgs. Then I was a part of the National Association for Asian American Professionals. I went to a Korean American church. So I was doing anything, everything Asian American. And that's when I really started to build that. And I was late to the party, as the saying goes, of trying to learn more about my identity. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I was able to really get more and more engaged and more excited about this and wanting to help more and more of the AAPI students that I was working with at the various campuses I had worked at, in addition to the Midwest Asian American Students Union, MASU, that I was on the board of advisors of, and other things like that. And then, of course, it added more limelight to it when I had a chance to be in my friend's wedding in Taiwan. And while I was there in Taiwan, I was able to go to Seoul, South Korea for like less than 24-hour trip.
How old were you?
It was in 2003. So
was that the first time you've
it was
been
my
back
first
to
time since 1976. Yeah. So I've been there. I've now been there twice. The second time I was there on behalf of when I worked at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where we chaperoned some students for case study competition. And that in itself was a great experience because I had Korean older men that were seeing this disconnect. And then when I said that I'm adopted, I had various different reactions. I didn't know what I would get. Some of them were just like, oh, okay. And then others went as far as hugging me. One was in tears, and one even went as far as saying, we're sorry we couldn't take care of our own. So this whole Korean nationalism was very prominent in those discussions.
And how did that make you feel?
Oh, it was inspiring for me because I didn't know if there was going to be a backlash per se. Not that I have ever read anything about that, and again, that was 2003. The internet was not that robust at the time, so we weren't able to look up too much. Not that I ever did try to do that. I did have a friend who knew another friend who went to Yonsei University, who I was able to meet up with when I was there, try to look up some of my records, but all of it was gone because the orphanage that I was at, I was hoping to come see it, but they had already torn it down, and it was like a mall is now there, or something like shopping center or whatever. So,
Hmm.
um, it's Frontline has done many stories on this. Maybe if I feel industrious, I might take more of my records and try to dig deeper, and in terms of at least whatever they may have on file in Korea. But for now, that's really the story. But because of all that, that's what made me want to start up my nonprofit.
Well, inspiring and admirationable at the same time. So it's a great arc. There, we spoke about development and the organisation, Asian Student Achievement. Talking more widely, and you mentioned podcasts. What the podcasts you're tuning into right now? You said most of them are for entertainment, but I'm always curious to hear what
Yes,
recommendations people have. Anything
it's
I can add to this?
uh, now I'm forgetting the name, but it's got Jason Bateman and uh, it's the three guys, Sean Hayes. Um, that's the one I listen to a lot when I'm like driving long distances. If I'm by myself. Um,
Smartless.
Smartless, that's it. Yes,
There we
I knew
go.
you'd be able to find it quickly. And
Look at
then
Google.
other times I listen to political ones too, because it's always great to hear what other people are saying about things. But Smartless is common. I used to listen to uh, the one that Conan Needs a Friend. So again, because I'm really into a lot of the uh, comedians, because I think they're funny, and I like to think I'm funny when I have that opportunity.
Have you
So
ever done stand
it,
up?
no, but
Just dad
I
jokes.
mainly because of the profession that I was in, I was scared that it could backfire, right? Because you really got to have that separate line of working with college students in higher education, and then you being able to just have the freedom of speech to say whatever, and those would not match. Not that I would be crude, but it'd be more of like, one of the things that comedians are great at, and I like to think I'm decent at, is quick on my feet. Now,
Witty.
I'm not quick on my feet of memory, as you can tell, but quick on my feet of like being able to respond back to someone when they come at you with this. I'm able to come back at them in that way, and that's what comedians are very good at.
Ironically, I started reading a book 2 days ago. Got it in front of me here. It's called The Art of Witty Banter: Be Clever, Quick, and Magnetic. So I'm only 3 days into it, but it's yeah, just little things that I'm picking up, and I think especially being a podcast host, it might not be you want to be banterous or funny, but a lot of comedians, they're very good at asking questions because they're not specifically asking closed questions. It's more open-ended questions. And what I love about this is I never know what direction these conversations are going to go into.
Right.
And I quite enjoy having less information because that means that, as you and I, we've had a few conversations before we shot this. It's you feel like you open up something, and once you've opened it up, you don't want to feel like you've watched the end of the movie, so you know how it ends. You'd rather watch the whole movie, so it's a surprise to you, and then that way you can think on your feet, and you'll think of questions in the moment that if you have time to think of, they won't come across as organically and natural. And yeah, interesting that yeah, we've spoken about your comedic sense, which I hope I've got a little bit myself, and the book that I'm reading right now. So there's a good synergy. Have you thought about maybe doing a stand-up show now, maybe a few years on?
No, I'm pretty much dedicated to this. I when I meet up with interns, even for interviews, I'll say, I want you to have grandkids say, "Hey, have you heard of Asian Student Achievement?" And they go, "Yes, I got to work with the president, CEO, and founder of the organization, but he died like 10 years ago." and people laugh at that, or they're like, oh, like that, shocked. And I said the whole point of that is I want this organization to live in eternity, and so with the organization that we have, the population that we work with, the mission that we're trying to do, um, it's hard to find clean jokes. And as we all know, Seinfeld is probably the best that does great jokes that are about everyday stuff that people, you know, gripe about, right? Most of it, I would say 90% of his jokes are clean, right? There's not any in territory that's really volatile or quote unquote cancel. And so if I could think that way more, then maybe, but it's too much of a risk. If anything, it'd be more of like where I will be more risky is get me in front of a karaoke machine and I'm more than happy to perform in front of anyone.
What would be your go-to songs?
Many, many. So I always start with because I gotta get my voice going. But the Billy Joel's Piano Man is always a good one. Faithfully from Journey. In fact, a quick funny story. We just did karaoke at the NAP convention last year in Houston, Texas, and Lou Diamond Phillips was at that event, and he was one of our speakers. But he also came to the karaoke event, and I was up on stage singing faithfully. And afterwards, he came up to me. He was like, "Dude, you did a great job. Way to sing that song." So it felt good to have, the star that I've been watching in movies and shows when I was a kid, and being in La Bamba, who sang that song, say good job. So that always makes you feel good. But it's all the fun ones, Sweet Caroline, those are always good, and even some ones that people haven't heard of because of my age, especially if I'm with younger folks.
Well, I hope you put those cameos on the website because I'm sure there'll be great advertisements for how authentic the organization
I
is.
guess that's a good point. I should probably do that.
Talking about the organization, how many students do you typically work with in a given year?
Well, I would say from the January to December, average of 600 to 1,000 plus, and it's mainly because of where we get invited to, right? And that's a mix of students, professionals, and entry level professionals. So sometimes whether it's me being invited to corporations to speak at college campuses, student conferences. For example, I was just at Indiana University last weekend at the Midwest Asian American Students Union Spring Conference and spoke on two topics there. But then, a few months ago, I spoke on public speaking virtually to a corporation, and being about 80 some folks there to teach them about how to do public speaking. My core thing I try to do regularly is make sure they're very interactive, to
Hmm.
especially for students. And I don't care what age you are. Today's attention span is a gnat, so you really got to keep them engaged. And most college students have gone through a whole week of listening to their professors, whether they're entertaining or talking heads and boring them. So I don't want them to go to a conference or them invite me to their campus and then they get another boring person. So I'm always making sure that they're have an interactive activity, and because of that, I think they not. I think I know they learn more. I jokingly say that I'm not famous, but when you do have my speaking engagement, you will definitely remember the things that I taught you for the rest of your lives, and that's my goal.
Yeah, I mean, I can think back to university, college, and there are certain lecturers, if we just talk about university, that massively stand out. If someone wanted to follow suit and become more engaging, more uh, charismatic, what would you recommend to someone who wants to get better at public speaking? Is there anything that you have a de facto go to?
When I do, I'll tell you what I do in the exercise, and then go back to your question. But in the exercise, I start off with the bullet points. What all you know people should consider. I try to start with a comedic line that I didn't make up. It's been out there before, but I I, I told them, the ones that came in, just for example, last weekend, I said, I appreciate each and every one of you all coming in today, because what you're telling me is you want to live. And why I mention that is because in my description, I put some people would rather die than go do public speaking. So I mentioned that, and you get a little snicker about that, because a lot of them are very fearful of it and would rather just not do everything else but do public speaking. Sidebar, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm going off tangent. I went to a national convention for a student organization, and it was our first public speaking engagement at a national conference, and we were excited about it. My colleague and I. He's the one that created that cool title, "Learn Public Speaking from a TEDx Speaker." And then we got the date and time, and it was on a Friday at 3:30 p.m. I said, "Crap, Michael, we are not. We'll be lucky if we have 12 people there. Friday at a 3:30. Who's going to want to attend that?" And it was about 75 plus people that attended. I was shocked because, and what was interesting was half of them were students, and the other half were actually the exhibitors, i.e., the recruiters at the various companies that were looking for candidates. And they range from, college student ages all the way to like a 60-year-old. And it just shows you that it doesn't matter your age, your ethnicity, your profession, what you're in. People are wanting to learn more about that. So when I do the talking heads, then I have them break up into groups and do actual presentations to each other. And their goal is to talk about something I know they would know about, because most of them are part of a AAPI organization. So they got to convince the other person to have them join that organization. And they get 2 minutes to speak, and then the other person is giving them feedback on that, and vice versa. So, the tactics I tell people to do is, number one, they have more resources than I did when I grew up. The resource we had was the mirror. If we had a camera, you had to be in a pretty wealthy home to have like a really nice camera, or it was like literally the tape type of cameras. We didn't have that. But now they have phones, with cameras. And I encourage them to videotape themselves and then take the tactical concepts of, whether you want to write out a speech, whether you want to do all those different things to be able to do the practicing. And then, of course, practice in front of friends that are going to give you honest feedback. And I think the hardest thing for a lot of people is watching themselves. So then when they watch themselves, hear themselves, they're already like taking many notches down on their confidence, because they're like, ugh. And then when they see someone going, they're not realizing they're doing it while they're doing it, but then they see it when they watch the video. So those are the ways that I always encourage people to practice and make their speeches just a little better and smoother.
To your points there, whenever any of the guys on my sales team are looking at feedback, and even myself, it's arguably the most embarrassing thing. It's kind of like looking at yourself in the mirror with no clothes on. You're thinking, whoa, I thought I looked a lot better than that, actually. But then I think what's great about what you've mentioned there is how quick you receive feedback. The feedback loop is so fast that even these podcasts, I sometimes cringe. I'll listen to the podcast and think, oh my God, why did you say that? Or did you really sound that bad? Or did you, as you mentioned, all of these small subtleties, like I just said there, to space the gap out, you start to realize that you can pace yourself, take time. And even this book that I mentioned about the art of witty banter, they mention if you want to sound more intelligent, take 2 seconds to answer someone's question. So it sounds and seems as though you've paid more attention to what they've said, as opposed to just jumping straight into things. So there's some really valuable tips and stuff that I'll personally take myself, because I'm always trying to improve at public speaking and communication, because it's the cornerstone of any business, really.
Well, another tangential experience I've had that has helped me to be very comfortable in doing all this stuff is I've worked at a student-run radio station as well as an NPR affiliate. and public address announcing for sporting events to horse shows. So, all that experience combined has really helped me to be able to diversify how I come off in terms of different things. In fact, when someone asked me to, even I've been asked to do auctioneering, live auctioneering, that, as well as someone told me, well, can you do the voice of public address announcing? And it's a different voice or different volume, different cadence of how you do that
Hmm.
versus when you're doing your regular talking. And or someone will see me from one of the horse shows I did, and they're like, "Oh, you're the horse show announcer," and then they talk with me, and they're like, "Wait, are you the horse show announcer? Because you don't sound the same." So it's kind of funny.
So what you're saying is that you'll be happy to redo the voiceover introduction for this podcast.
No, I'm all good.
There we go. I definitely know what you mean. It's similar to acting or performing. You have two personalities. You go into this zone where you really
Right.
sit up straight and you're more laser focused with the precision of your words. And I generally find I've had a few days where I've shot three of these podcasts and I can't work afterwards. Because I put so much energy into the focus of the podcast and in the background you're making notes and you're just your brain's just trying to think two steps ahead of the guest because you're thinking I don't want to have any dead spots or pauses within the podcast. So I suppose there's a lot of similarities to you talking there, and I can imagine once you get home, your throat probably feels a bit dry and you feel quite exhausted, but you feel quite achieved, I imagine.
I you bring up a good point because in your job it's got to be hard, and that's why you vet it in advance. Because if it's just like any general, like when you're doing presentations and you're wanting engagement from students, and they give you like 1-2 word responses, and you're like, this is not going to last for a podcast, right? So they've got to be storytellers. They got to be able to talk out to stretch the length, or as we've seen in some situations where you'll see, especially in the TV industry, they'll do this, meaning like stretch it out because we still have like 20 seconds before we go off air, right? And those type of things. So no, I hear you. I agree with what you're saying in terms of that. And your work is definitely not easy, and kudos to what you're doing in terms of creating these.
Appreciated. There's a very good book that I read just before Christmas called How to Speak to Idiots, I believe it was. And what it essentially looks at, it isn't exactly idiots, but what it's saying is it color coded people into four groups:
Hmm.
red, yellow, blue, green. And I'll let you use your own imagination as to what you think those people are like. I won't go into into the details I mentioned before on a previous podcast. But essentially, if you think so, I would hazard a guess to say that you're a yellow, green, yellow, red. And when I looked at my own color, which I roughly put the same, and other people, it's just the way how I articulate it now is if you can't communicate well with someone, it's more just a case of you speak a different language to them. So it's not a case of you're there and the other person can speak English and you can speak English. It's a bit more of a case of you are speaking English, the other person is speaking Korean, and another person is speaking Portuguese and Spanish. I think our connection's cut out a little bit there. But essentially, it's just a case of you just don't speak the same language as the other person. You just have to learn how to speak their language. So it's more a case of taking a step back, analyzing what's making that person tick, and then trying to cooperate or conform to what makes them feel more comfortable. And I think it's one of the biggest things I've learned as a leader is if someone sees something different to you, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that they've got a completely different view to you. That's something I've learned. I have a curious question. So, I've been running Asian Student Achievement now for the best part of 8 years, 9 years actually. Sorry. In those 9 years, have you had a moment where you felt like really packing in the tools and giving up?
The long-winded answer to this is talking to an entrepreneur before I started this. And I remember literally right across from my place, I live in a condo, there's a Chili's, we sat down, at the bar, and he said, Shane, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you got to pick something that you are ridiculously passionate about. And I thought that was the best advice I ever got, because of course it's very easy to think that way, but if you are really wanting to truly say that you created this experience, this organization, through high water or low water, you're going to definitely going to pass through it. I'm not going to go in great detail, but of course, there's been a lot of roadblocks that I wasn't expecting, whether it's people personality to logistical issues with learning how to do payroll, dealing with the states, the federal 990 taxes, all those things that you don't do every day when you're on the employer side, because you're always on the employee side, right? And so all that can also just be a nuisance. And, in today's generation, people leave. They don't stay in jobs 5, 10, 20 years. So, of course, you're going to have a turnstile of people coming in and out. And then trying to find the best match of your personality, your expectations, and what you want to get out of it, juxtaposed to those that you're hiring. And hopefully, because as this, when you're hiring someone, there's an investment of time, energy, training, and you hope that that will last a while instead of them leaving at a certain time. So all that combined, uh, at no point have I wanted to quit. And it's because the eye on the ball, and as cheesy it may sound, is truly the aspect of every student I can make an impact and help out, or entry level professional, then it's the MasterCard commercial of pricelessness, And so, like, one example that talks about money and a student, and is so surreal, that's a true pricelessness. And I had a student from a university who was our tech intern. We upgraded her to become a marketing lead because I loved how her organization style, everything about her professionalism was spectacular. She wanted to stay in tech, but I said, you're going to be interning at Siemens this summer. You're going to get more than enough, tech with them. We're not going to have that type of tech for you. So she took the effort. So she became really what we call technology and management in most university settings, right? But she got to get that experience. She had that tech experience. Now she gets to do the management experience and working with the marketing side, even though she wasn't seasoned in marketing. So she finishes off the summer. And then at the end of her internship at Siemens, I get a notice in our donor box where we use as our platform $100. So a student from that student, $100 from a student is considered huge. I mean, I've had people that make 10 times more money and don't give me that much money, So for an undergraduate student that gives $100 was just like a lot to me. And I talked to her and I said, "Oh my goodness," we'll call her Jenny. I said, "Jenny, why? This is spectacular. What made you do this?" And she said, "Out of all my cohorts in the organization, my supervisor said you were the only one that was most prepared in the professional setting. And I credit Asian Student Achievement for giving me that experience." When you hear stories like that every day, that's why, yeah, there can be some tough issues that you deal with, but I want to continue more stories like that. What we're doing in our organization is giving them new skill sets, harnessing skill sets that they already have. But we're also, especially in the internship program we have, we're building confidence. We're creating portfolios for them. We're creating opportunities. I mean, a lot of our current students, and I would even say people that are older, which they have no excuse for, but the younger ones, it's still mesmerizing to me. After an interview, a lot of them never send a thank you note. And I'm like, where did that come out of? Where did anyone not teach you thank you notes. And what made it more surprising is because in the Asian American and Asian culture, it's always about respect to elders. And so it was very confusing. I even told one of them, I said, "What is it about you all not sending thank you notes?" And she honestly said, "We thought it came off thirsty." I was like, "What? No." And I gave her an example where I was in another organization where my boss and I said, "All right, we have 3 to 4 candidates, and we're going to move them on. Which ones sent thank you notes and which ones didn't?" That was like the deciding factor if they were almost equally the same. And I tell that story to them because it's so important to respond within 24 hours, sending thank you notes, return on investment, teaching them. I can't tell you how many former student interns that hated doing return on investment tactics that we would teach them. And then they go into paid internships or other future jobs where they're actually having to do actual sales, or they now know what ROI means because and their cohorts don't. And those are the things that we're giving them. So after it can get gray, after it can get dark, the light that keeps on shining is when we can inspire, help these students and make a difference. And that's what it's all about. And that's why, so many of us went into higher education too, because we know that we can make an impact on students. And if we can do that, then we've done our job.
Curious, you mentioned ROI tactics. Is there any examples that you could share with us on this podcast? Because it's something I find
Oh,
very
yeah.
curious.
So some of the tactics is what I call the bare minimum one would be, like our post, repost our post, those type of things on our social media platforms. Another way, of course, the most obvious would be ask your family members, ask your friends to give to our organization because it is a nonprofit and they get a tax deductible gift when they give. We now have partnerships with Bison Candles, Sugar Bliss, and both of them alone during Asian American Heritage Month. We're going to be selling products in May, and proceeds are going to go. Some of the proceeds are going to go to us, and so they can get other people engaged. Can they find us friends of theirs or connections to to sign up as interns? Can they find university, their campus or other universities or organizations to invite us for paid speaking engagements? So those are different ways of how we teach them about ROI efforts and the way they go about it, the way they take it on. Sometimes they do it begrudgingly because that's just not their comfort zone,
Hmm.
especially if they're like a graphic designer and they're not in the business development role. Of course, that's definitely way different to what they signed up for. But they know it going in all the interviews. But whether they like it or hate it or lukewarm to it, when they leave, I feel confident that when they get hit with that expectation in their next job, they're going to at least have the experience with us and will be more prepared for it. I remember talking to a high level representative at US Bank in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and she was like, "That's so exciting. You're encouraging your interns to do that because I get so many new employees that come in that just don't know how to sell themselves or sell the company."
Very valid. Very valid. Shane, where can people find you and what's next for you?
Well, they can go to Google at Asian Student Achievement, or they can go to learnasa.org, which is right here, www.learnasa.org. And of course, anyone that's watching this, if they feel moved, they can go to our website, click on Give Today, and make a tax deductible gift. And always wanting more people to support these initiatives, leadership experiences for these students, and helping them move through the pipeline to leadership.
Shane, appreciate your time.
Thank you.